Have you ever seen either on TV or a real life situation where someone threw caution to the wind and rushed into a dangerous situation and came out a hero? Or someone who took a huge financial risk and came out a multimillionaire? And when they were interviewed, you heard them say, "I wasn't brave, I was desperate. That was my best friend in that burning house. Of course I ran in to get him." Or maybe you heard the fabulously rich man say, "I may be fortunate, but hardly courageous. Frankly," he would say, "I was at a point where I had nothing to lose." You'd have done the same. This morning, for a few moments, let us examine the lives of four losers, if you will. And let's call them the Starvation Committee, shall we? The setting is following the King David and King Solomon's reign in Israel. God's people had split into two kingdoms. The southern kingdom, Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital, and the northern kingdom, Israel, with Samaria as its capital. The northern kingdom was known for really bad kings. This was taking place there at this time of this story in this northern kingdom. The prophet Elisha ministered to them. Aram was the ancient biblical name of the present-day country of Syria. Relations between Israel and Syria were, as they are today, not quite so good. Not good at all. In 2 Kings, the 6th chapter, the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, laid siege to Samaria, the capital of Israel, that capital city. No one was allowed in or out of the city. They were under siege. A siege was to starve you into surrender or to reduce you to such weakness that you were unable to resist. The famine had lasted so long that people were eating anything. They were eating donkeys' heads for food. The scriptures tell us that they would cost you about 80 shekels of silver, or about 2 pounds of silver for one of those donkey heads that you could eat for food, because the rest of the donkey had already been served up for food. Now, at today's current price of silver, $17.57 an ounce. That was $562.24 of today's money that they would pay for a donkey's head to eat. Things were so bad. The siege in the city was so effective that they resorted to cannibalism. The king directs his anger and the blame on Elisha. Because of all this going on, Elisha, God's man, and he swore that he was going to cut Elisha's head off. And as the story proceeds, King Joram arrives at Elisha's house with his number one aide. But Elisha, being the good prophet that he was, knew already that he was coming, okay? The king was coming, and he also knew what the king intended to do. Slice his head off. But Elisha turns the tables on the king with great news. He tells the king that the famine and the siege in the city of Samaria will be over tomorrow. That's not the news the king expected. It's going to be over tomorrow. Now keep in mind that this is not Jerusalem. This is Samaria, the capital city of the rebellious northern kingdom. So why would God rescue a rebellious people? Why would he give Elisha this message to rescue a rebellious people? Because God chose to, and because God is good and merciful. That's why. After all, if God only rescued the deserving, where would that leave you and me? You and I could kiss it goodbye. The human race would long ago have ceased to exist. If God's mercy depended upon us and our actions. So how do we see in the story the good news? How was it received by the king as Elijah gave him this news? With joy? With praise to God? With thanks? No. In fact, the king stands there before Elisha not quite really knowing what to say because he did not expect this good news. But the king's number one man was cynical and full of unbelief. So he says, it's not going to happen. And the prophet Elisha says to him, Sir, you will see it happen tomorrow, but you will not live to enjoy it. Now, to the Starvation Committee, if you please. Gathered just outside the gates of the city of Samaria. It doesn't get much worse than being a leper in that day. They were total, complete outcasts. They were contagious. There was a threat of catching the leprosy. Plus, the lepers were considered cursed by God. Not trusted. Their word was not to be taken seriously. And now to our text. And I've chosen to read from you from the Clear Word, a paraphrase, but the reason I'm using that is because it is a story, and read in a story form can take on more meaning for us. So again, the text, 2 Kings, the 7th chapter, verses 3 and 4. Late that afternoon, now this is following this visit by the king to Elisha and Elisha's proclamation to him. Late that afternoon, 4 men with leprosy were sitting outside the city gate. They said to each other, why sit we here until we die? They won't let us into the city to beg for the food that we need because they hardly have enough for themselves to eat. So it's no point in going into the city. If we stay here, we'll starve to death. Let's go over to the Syrians. The worst they can do is kill us. But they might give us something to eat and they might let us live. Why sit we here until we die? This is a question considered by the members of this starvation committee, if you will, these 4 lepers. For many days, the city of Samaria had been closely shut in. The food supply had been cut off. Hunger is stalking the streets. Unless relief comes soon and very soon, all will die. And amongst the first to feel the pinch of this hunger were the members of this starvation committee. They were beggars to begin with. A calamity for others where they had no food certainly meant starvation for them. So these 4 members of the starvation committee are dying by the inch already. And it is to cope with this situation that the committee meeting is called. Every man of the 4 is a leper. Every one of them is penniless. Every one of the 4 is tortured by hunger. Every man on this starvation committee is facing death. These 4 are a great common sense consideration for us all. Through their deliberations, this committee of 4, this starvation committee, they came to the wisest possible conclusion. First, their first conclusion to which they came is they resolved that there need to be some kind of action taken. They resolved that we will act now, for why sit here until we die? You know, it's a good day. I say this after a career of committees. Far too many I have chaired. Okay? It's a good day for any committee when such a decision is reached. It's hard to get any action on a committee. It's so easy for us to just sit and deliberate and talk and talk and talk and never do anything. This committee was driven to action by a great compelling need, if you will. If all of your needs are met, it is easy to defer doing anything. The second reason that led these wise men to take an action was that any action is better than inaction. This starvation committee knew this. There was absolutely nothing to be gained by inaction. They would all starve. And now, having decided on action, the next question was, what would they do? What would that action be? There were 3 roads open to them as they sat outside of the gate of the city starving. Go into the city, stay where they were, but there's a third road, and they resolved to do that. They resolved to fall into the hands of the Syrians, the army that was besieging them all. Not because they could force the Syrians to give them food. Not because the Syrians were their friends. Certainly not because they were invited. The reason given for them to decide to fall into the hands of the Syrians is it's not an absolute certainty, not absolutely certain that the Syrians would kill them. There was every possibility and every probability that the Syrians would kill them. The odds were perhaps 1,000 to 1, or someone could say 1 in a million, okay? Yet there was at least a chance. They looked at their situation. The odds were better that they go to the city of Samaria than to stay where they were. And the record says that they put their decision into action. When you make resolutions, the time to act is now as you make the resolution. The longer we put off a decision that we make to a later time, the less likely that we will ever carry the decision out. This Starvation Committee turned their faces toward the enemy. They do not go eagerly as though they had great expectations. They know there is a great chance that death is imminent if they go toward the camp of the Syrian army. And they're very near the camp of the Syrians. They're extremely cautious. There's not a man in sight. And let's let the record speak further in 2 Kings, the 7th chapter, verses 5 through 8. 2 Kings 7, 5 through 8. That evening, as it began to get dark, the men made their way over to the Syrians. When they got there, they found the whole camp empty. Not a single soldier anywhere. The Lord had caused the Syrians to hear what sounded like a huge army with horses and chariots coming to rescue Samaria. When the Syrians heard this, they said to each other, "The king of Israel has hired the Hittites and the Egyptians to attack us. Let's get out of here." So they ran for their lives, this whole army, and they left behind everything: horses, donkeys, equipment, tons of food. They left the camp just as it was. And just after they left, the 4 lepers reached the camp, verse 8 tells us, and they found it empty. They went into one of the tents, which was loaded with food, and they ate and drank. They took the silver and the gold and the clothing that they found, and they ran and hid it. And then they did the same thing in the next tent, it tells us. There is something further about this Starvation Committee. They had a second meeting. In it, they did a critique of themselves. And they basically said, "We're acting like pigs." There are thousands back there in the city of Samaria who we would not have survived without, because they have always fed us. And here we could have more than we could eat or spend in our lifetime, and they're back there starving to death in the city of Samaria. And they voted to go and share the good news immediately. They realized that a delay could bring bad news. Number one, the Syrians could return and finish them off. And the even worse news, the thousands in the city of Samaria would then not hear or partake of the good news, and they would all starve. The record continues in 2 Kings, the 7th chapter, verses 9 through 11. When they came back after hiding some more things, they said to each other, "This isn't right. We can't keep all these things to ourselves. Let's go back to Samaria and tell the king what we found. If we wait till daylight, the Lord will surely punish us for not sharing with others." So they ran back to the city in the dark, and at the gate they called out to the guards, "We went to ask the Syrians for food and found the whole camp empty. No one is there, but the horses, donkeys, all the equipment, and the tents intact. Come and see." The record continues in the 11th verse. The guards shouted the news to the people in the palace. You see, the Starvation Committee had to call the watchmen from outside the gates of the city. Remember, they're lepers and no one wants them in the city. So they called out to the gatekeepers, thus announcing the incredible news. Now on with the record again. In 2 Kings, the 7th chapter, verse 12. The king was already in bed. He got up and said to his officers, I'll tell you what's happening. Let me tell you, as your leader. The Syrians know that our people are starving, so they've left the camp and they've hidden, thinking that we would come out of the camp and then leave the camp, and then they'll attack us and they can take our city without a fight. There are two dynamics going on here. Remember, the lepers were by some regarded as under the curse of God and not generally regarded as somebody to be trusted. And secondly, the king was not a godly, believing man. The king assumes the worst. There's got to be a catch. It's a trick. Never mind that a day earlier, Elisha had promised that the next day God would provide food in abundance. Thankfully, someone on the committee or someone next to the king offered a suggestion. The record continues in 2 Kings 7, verses 13 and 14. One of the officers spoke up. He says to the king, let's send some men on the 5 horses we've got left to scout things out. If they're caught and killed, they'll only die a day or two earlier, because if nothing happens soon, we're all going to be dead here anyway. The king agreed and sent out 2 chariots and 4 horses. He said to the drivers, go out and find what happened, but be careful. So at least they investigate. Wait a minute. He said they only have 5 horses left. That's because all the horses but the 5 had been eaten. So there were 5 left, but the king sends out 4. Picture the king. I'll send 4 horses out. I'm not sending 5. I'm not going to get stuck here without a horse. If that's your plan, then it goes south. The king looked out for himself and left him in an escape hatch. So the record goes on in 2 Kings 7, the 15th verse. So the men rode off and found the camp of the Syrians completely empty. They followed their trail for 20 miles all the way to the Jordan River. It was strewn with equipment and clothes that the Syrians in their haste had thrown away. So they headed back to Samaria and reported it to the king. Those Syrians panicked so badly, because when God scares you, it's a pretty good scare, okay? But they panicked so badly on foot, they had no time to saddle their horses. They took their armor and their weapons off, and they fled for their lives. That's the way it is when we have to consider life or death, isn't it? Life is the most important thing. The story goes on in 2 Kings 7, verse 16. When the people heard what had happened, they rushed out of the city and looted the camp of the Syrians. And that day, 10 pounds of the best wheat or 20 pounds of the best barley sold for 1 piece of silver, just as the Lord through Elisha had said. Israel's capital city of Samaria was saved. No souls were lost. Well, no, except one. The story concludes as the record closes in 2 Kings 7, verses 17 through 20. It so happened that the king had put the same officer in charge of the city gate who had gone with him to see Elisha the day before. When he opened the gates to let the people out, he was knocked down and trampled to death. So he died and never did get to taste any of the food, just as Elisha had said. Elisha's prophecy about the price of food also came true. The record continues. Tomorrow, 10 pounds of fine wheat or 20 pounds of fine barley will be sold for 1 piece of silver. The officer, the record says, had said to Elisha, that will never happen. Do you think the Lord will rain wheat and barley from heaven just to help us? And Elisha had said to him, because you said that, you will see it happen, but you won't get to eat it. The record concludes, so it happened exactly as Elisha had said it would. The people trampled the officers to death in the gate of the city. Unbelief and skepticism had cost the officer his life. Thus ends the story of the Starvation Committee. It is a classic story from a biblical perspective of dilemma and deliverance. Consider the problem. Consider the characters. Consider the ways of God. And consider the value of decisive action. Who would you think that God would use to bring deliverance to a group of ungodly people? 4 lepers he sent as a starvation committee to extend his mercy. Just think how he, God, could use each of us. Ponder, I give you an assignment for this week. Ponder on how God can use ways and people we would never think of to help us. Think on 2 Kings 6 and 7. Remember, as you ponder in the week ahead, yes, remember the Starvation Committee.
Chose me out of millions, your child to be. You know all the wrong I have done. Oh, how could you pardon me, forgive my iniquity, to save me, give Jesus your Son. But Lord, help me be what you want me to be. Your word I will strive to obey. My life I now give, for you I will live, and walk by your side all the way. I am amazed to know that a God so great could love me so, is willing and wanting to bless. His grace is so wonderful, His mercy I can't understand it, I confess. But Lord, help me be what you want me to be. Your word I will strive to obey. My life I now give, for you I will live, and walk by your side all the way. My life I now give, for you I will live, and walk by